We dive into Ernest Hemingway's Men Without Women, one of the most powerful short story collections of the 20th century. Imagine walking the rain-slick streets of Prohibition-era America, pausing at a railway station tucked in Spanish hills, and standing on the edge of an empty lumber town. While we move through these places, we feel the hard-boiled style, the iceberg theory, and the lingering echo of war trauma that haunts every page. Our aim is not just to tell the plots. We want to sense the weight of each unsaid thought, hear the silence between the dialogue, and see how Hemingway's masculine code both shields and isolates his characters. Along the way, we will touch on Viktor Frankl's idea of the existential vacuum, notice the stoic attitudes that surface in crisis, and ask whether the darkness in these stories ends in hopelessness or points toward meaning. First, let's set the scene. The year is 1927. The world is still shaking from the Great War. A group of writers, artists, and thinkers called the Lost Generation, a name given by Gertrude Stein, are searching for new ways to describe a broken reality. Hemingway, a young journalist-turned-novelist, had already made a name within our time and was about to publish The Sun Also Rises. Men Without Women arrived at the brink of his rise, offering 14 tight narratives that sharpened his emerging voice. Critics praised its stark realism. Some readers were unsettled by the lack of women in the titles and the stories themselves. That very emptiness becomes a theme, a void that forces us to notice what is missing as much as what is present. The first story we meet is The Killers. In a small Midwestern town, two hitmen walk into a cheap diner. They announce in calm, matter-of-fact tones that Ole Anderson, a former boxer now working as a night watchman, will be killed the next morning. Ole sits behind the counter, shoulders slumped, eyes distant. The townspeople stare but do nothing. Hemingway never tells us why Ole is targeted, nor does he reveal the killer's inner thoughts, yet the tension is thick. Each sentence is short, like a clean cut, mirroring the cold efficiency of the assassins. The story shows the hard-boiled look, an urban backdrop filled with morally gray people, a focus on action instead of deep reflection, and an emotional restraint that feels surgical. It also lives by the iceberg theory. The visible tip, the men waiting, the gunshots that never fire, hints at a massive hidden mass of fear, resignation, and perhaps a personal code that makes Ole accept his fate without protest. Readers feel the weight of unspoken history, a generation scarred by war, a personal rule that equates silence with dignity, and a society numb enough to treat violence as routine. Crossing the Atlantic, we find ourselves in hills like white elephants. An American man and a woman named Jig sit at a train station in the Ebro Valley. The landscape splits between dry, barren hills and a river that glitters like a promise. Their talk circles around the operation, a thinly veiled reference to an abortion. The man uses clinical, reassuring phrases, "It's really an awfully simple operation," while Jig's replies become fragmented, her laughter turning hollow. Hemingway never says the word abortion. He lets the subtext carry the emotional load. The hills described like white elephants become a metaphor for something unwanted yet impossible to discard. The silence between their lines forms a chasm of gendered power, the man's logic versus the woman's suppressed anguish. Here the iceberg theory works on a relational level. Spoken words are only the surface, while deeper currents of fear, love, and autonomy swirl below. The masculine code in this story is not about physical bravado but about control through language, an attempt to solve an existential dilemma with logic rather than feeling. The story ends without a clear decision, leaving the reader hanging in the same uncertainty that grips the characters, echoing the existential vacuum Frankl described, a restless emptiness that lingers even when outward circumstances seem settled. War trauma threads itself through many of the remaining tales, often in subtle ways. In Another Country, a group of wounded soldiers gather. Imagine a hospital in Milan, right after the armistice. In this quiet ward, wounded soldiers gather. They trade medals and talk about a strange new technology, machines that can actually restore a person's sight. But their conversations are cold and detached. They speak about their injuries as if they belong to someone else. The narrator is a young American. He feels like a stranger in his own life, completely cut off from the world of civilians. To him, the spirit of the battlefield has followed him home, lingering in the silence of the hospital. Hemingway does not give us dramatic flashbacks or screaming nightmares. Instead, he shows us the small things. He shows veterans who cannot connect with each other, men who cling to simple routines like polishing their medals just to get through the day. They wear a mask of stoicism, This is not a peaceful kind of calm, but a hardened shell. It is a shield built from the cultural belief that men must suffer in silence. This reminds us of the ideas of Viktor Frankl. Frankl noticed that people in the most extreme conditions often cling to tiny freedoms. He called this the space between a stimulus and a response. For these soldiers, polishing a metal is that tiny space. It is a small, trivial choice they can make in a world where their injuries have taken everything else away. Then we look at the story of Francis Macomber. This one takes place on an African safari. We meet Francis, a wealthy American hunter, his wife Margaret, and their experienced guide Robert Wilson. At first, Francis is a coward. During a buffalo hunt, he freezes in fear and lets the animal escape. But later, something changes. He finds his courage and faces the beast with a new, fierce energy. Just as he charges the buffalo, a shot rings out. Francis is killed. The official report says it was a misfire, but the truth feels different. It seems Margaret may have killed him because she could not stand his new confidence. The dialogue here is short and sharp, hiding a storm of jealousy and fragile pride. It shows a dangerous code where a man's worth is measured only by his skill in the hunt. The title is a cruel joke. Macomber's life was only happy for a short time before it ended in tragedy. This is the iceberg theory in action. On the surface, it is a story about a hunt. Beneath the water, it is a study of post-war disillusionment and the desperate, futile attempt to win back a lost sense of manhood. Then there is Nick Adams in the story called The End of Something. He is in a deserted lumber town, a place where the forests have been stripped bare for profit. Nick and his girlfriend, Marjorie, walk through the ruins of what used to be a thriving woods. Right there, among the fallen trees, Nick decides to end their relationship. He does it with a casualness that feels wrong given the emotional weight of the moment. As he watches the last tree fall and hears the sound of the saws, he feels his own youthful optimism disappearing. The story is brief, leaving us to wonder why Nick feels he must cut these ties. Is it because the destroyed nature reflects the emptiness inside him, or is he following a personal code that values cold honesty over soft sentiment? The abrupt end of the story mirrors the abrupt end of the relationship. It suggests a bleak truth that nothing lasts, and the only honest way to handle the end is to accept it without any drama. When we look at these stories together, a pattern emerges. Every character follows a code. In one story, it is the unwritten rules of the underworld. In another, it is the way a couple justifies a difficult decision. For the veterans, it is a disciplined routine. For the hunters, it is a strict set of rules for the chase. This code is both a shield and a prison. It gives these men a map to navigate a chaotic world, but it also locks them away. It kills their vulnerability and stops them from truly connecting with others, especially women. This is why the collection is called Men Without Women. On the surface, it is about men who are alone. But deeper down, it describes an emotional desert. It is a place where intimacy has been dried up by a harsh, hyper-masculine way of living. To understand why this way of living is so powerful, we can look at the psychology of Viktor Frankl. In his book, Man's Search for Meaning, Frankl talks about the existential vacuum. This is a deep sense of emptiness that happens when the things that usually give life meaning, like religion or community, disappear. Frankl saw that even in concentration camps, people could choose their own attitude toward their suffering. This choice preserved a small piece of their freedom. This same gap between a stimulus and a response is what Hemingway builds between the spoken words and the hidden meaning. When a character like Ole Anderson accepts his own death without a fight, he is using this existential freedom. He refuses to let terror control him. There's a quiet terror in freedom, the kind that comes when you realize no one is telling you how to live. No script, no rules, just an endless stretch of choices. The philosopher Viktor Frankl called this the existential vacuum, that hollow feeling when life loses its why. And in Ernest Hemingway's Men Without Women, we watch characters drown in that very emptiness. They don't scream, they don't collapse. Instead, they polish their metals until the brass gleams. They play poker with faces like stone. They hunt not for food, but for something, anything to make them feel alive. Their lives become rituals, repeated motions that keep the void at bay, if only for a little while. But beneath the stillness, there's a restlessness, a gnawing hunger for something they can't name. Frankl warned that when meaning vanishes, people grab at three things to fill the gap. First, they blindly adopt whatever society tells them to want: the house, the job, the respect, without ever asking why. Second, they latch onto rigid ideologies, trading thought for the comfort of absolute rules. And third, they chase pleasure or distraction, using thrills like bandages on a wound that won't heal. Hemingway's stories lay these paths bare like a surgeon's scalpel. In The Killers, the townspeople do nothing as hitmen wait to murder a man. They don't intervene, don't question, just accept it as the way things are. That's conformity, upholding the rules even when the rules are broken. The hitmen themselves, they're the ideology, cold, efficient, following a code that demands death without remorse. They've outsourced their morality to a system, and in doing so, they've stopped being human. And the gamblers, the hunters, the drinkers, they're the pleasure seekers using risk like a drug. For a moment, the adrenaline burns bright enough to blind them to the emptiness. But when the high fades, the void is still there, waiting. Now here's the twist: these men look like stoics. They endure pain without complaint. They accept fate with a shrug. But real stoicism isn't just gritting your teeth and bearing it. It's about choosing how to respond, about finding meaning even in suffering. Hemingway's characters, they've skipped the choosing part. Their acceptance isn't wisdom, it's resignation. They've confused endurance with surrender. The philosopher Hegel called this freedom of the void, the illusion of being unbound when really you're just untethered, drifting in a sea with no stars to guide you. That's the trap in Men Without Women. The men think their silence, their discipline, their rituals make them strong. But all they've built is a cage of habit, and inside they're starving. Yet there are cracks in the darkness, moments where something like hope flickers. Take Francis Macomber and the short, happy life of Francis Macomber. For most of the story, he's a coward, paralyzed by fear, but in his final moments he changes. He stands his ground. He faces the lion, and for that brief, shining instant, he's free, not because he wins, but because he chooses. It's tragic, it's fleeting, but it's real. Or the soldiers in another country, bound together by wounds no one else can see. They don't talk about the war, not really. But in the quiet, in the shared glances, there's something like understanding. It's not much, but it's a thread to hold onto in the dark. Frankl called this tragic optimism, the idea that even in suffering, even in loss, meaning can be found, not by running from the pain, but by facing it. Hemingway's stories don't hand you a moral. They don't tie things up neat. Instead, they force you to lean in, to fill in the blanks, to ask, what would I do? That's the defiance at the heart of these tales. The search is the meaning. Hemingway's influence didn't end in the 1920s. His sharp, unflinching style carved the path for noir. Think Dashiell Hammett's detectives, Raymond Chandler's cynics. Writers like Raymond Carver took his less is more approach and ran with it, trusting readers to feel the weight beneath the silence. And those brooding, isolated men, they became a blueprint for exploring masculinity in all its fractured forms. Modern critics even see Hemingway's characters as early portraits of trauma. Long before PTSD had a name, he wrote men who flinched at loud noises, who drank to numb the memories, who couldn't explain why they felt hollow. He captured the cost of the code hero, the man who's so busy being strong he forgets how to be human. Now fast forward to today, the existential vacuum hasn't disappeared, it's just changed shape. Social media is the new distraction, an endless buffet of likes and shares that feel like connection but leave you hungrier than before. We curate perfect lives online while sitting alone in the dark, scrolling. The stoic mask Hemingway's men wore, the "I'm fine" while bleeding inside, is now the default setting for a generation. Frankl's warning still stands: you can't buy meaning, you can't filter it, you can't distract your way into purpose. It comes from engagement with your values, your pain, the people who see you when you're not performing. Men Without Women holds up a mirror: the rituals, the distractions, the tough guy acts, they're not armor. They're just ways to avoid admitting you're lost. So what's left? Maybe this: the search itself is the answer, not the finding, the looking, the willingness to stand in the void and ask, what now? Hemingway's men don't always have the words, but their silence speaks louder than any sermon. And maybe in the end, that's enough. True power does not come from piling on extra details. It comes from knowing exactly what to leave out. By stripping away heavy explanations, he pushes us to look at the empty spaces between the words. We learn to listen to the quiet moments. We feel the heavy weight of everything left unsaid. Think of it like a photograph with plenty of open space. The empty parts are not missing pieces. They are what give the picture its shape and focus. He wants us to sit in that quiet, He wants us to notice what is hiding in the silence. Next, look at the tough guy image that fills his early stories. This rigid code acts as a shield. It helps men survive harsh time, but it also traps them in deep loneliness. Society tells boys to act strong, teaches them to bury their fears behind a stone face, so they hide their soft spots. They pretend they do not hurt. This habit keeps repeating itself. One man stays silent, so the next man learns to stay silent too. They build walls around themselves. Those walls keep danger out, but they lock everyone inside alone. To understand why these men act this way, we can borrow a lens from psychology. Viktor Frankl wrote about how people search for purpose. He talked about an empty feeling inside, a hollow space where meaning should be. He also said we always have the freedom to pick our own attitude, even when life falls apart. He called this tragic hope. You face terrible things, yet you still find a reason to stand tall. These ideas shine a bright light on the story. They show us why the characters stand right on the edge of understanding. They almost touch a deeper truth, but they never quite grab hold of it. They hover in that gray area. Why does this matter today? Look around us now. Conflicts play out on glowing screens. Pain reaches us through quick news flashes. Everyone feels pushed to wear a perfect mask every single day. The old questions still burn hot. What do we do when we lose something we cannot get back? How do we live by a personal set of rules that keeps us honest without pushing everyone else away? Most importantly, can we pause before we react? Can we take that tiny gap between what happens to us and what we do next and fill it with careful thought? That narrow hallway does not have to lead to a brick wall. It can become a path toward real purpose. Picture yourself sitting on a wooden bench at a dusty train station. You hear the low rumble of an engine far down the track. You wonder if the train will ever pull in. Now shift your mind to a quiet roadside cafe. An old boxer sits alone at a table. Outside, the wind moves through branches of trees that used to cover the land. Imagine standing on dry grass in Africa. A hunter watches a massive beast charge straight toward him. Feel the thick tension in the air. Notice the heavy questions each person carries in their chest. In those frozen seconds, the writer hands you the pen. He asks you to help write the rest. You must guess what lies beneath the surface. You get to decide if the quiet is just an empty hole, or a blank sheet ready for your own answers. Let us step back into the time that shaped these pages. The years after the First Great War were a strange mix of healing and wild energy. Europe was still bandaging its wounds. At the same time, the 1920s roared forward with reckless joy. The author landed in Paris in 1921. He had just walked away from the bloody fields of Italy. He joined a scattered group of writers living abroad. Names like F. Scott Fitzgerald, Gertrude Stein, and Ezra Pound filled the cafes. This was not just a club for friends. It was a workshop for a brand new style. They valued short, sharp writing. They wanted raw honesty. Their plain approach matched the mood of a whole generation. These young people had seen machines tear human lives apart. They knew fancy words could not fix broken bones. Around the same time, gritty detective tales were taking over cheap paperbacks. Writers like Dashiell Hammett and Raymond Chandler painted dark city streets. Their heroes moved through crooked towns with a tired, watchful eye. Surprisingly, the streetwise style blended perfectly with the war-scarred landscapes of our main writer. Both traditions chased the same ghost. They hunted for something real in a world that felt fake. You see this blend clearly in a story about two hired guns. The killers do not care much about how to pull a trigger. They care about the cold fact that fate cannot be outrun. Their talk is clipped and flat. It sounds like a hard-boiled detective trading barbs, but the place they wait in changes the mood. It is a lonely little restaurant late at night. That quiet room echoes the muddy ditches of the old war. Men sat there waiting for order. They waited for explosions. Here they just wait for the clock to run out. The man who runs that shop shows us the heart of this puzzle. He stands caught between two worlds. He holds on to an old-school idea of honor, yet he is also a leftover piece in a town that forgot how to value it. When he hears the threat coming, he refuses to run. He knows running will not save him. This calm acceptance looks a lot like ancient wisdom. Old teachers said true strength means making peace with what you cannot control. But there is another layer underneath. There is a quiet emptiness. It whispers that the sky does not send rewards for bravery. The universe does not hand out reasons for suffering. That push and pull between steady courage and total emptiness is what makes him special. He connects the classic warrior of old myths to the weary outsider we see in modern tales. Moving up the map to a different tale, the scene changes completely. The loud clashes fade away. Instead, we face a softer struggle. It is just as heavy. It revolves around the quiet art of avoiding the truth. Let's talk about one of the most discussed stories in the collection, the one focused on the quiet, high-stakes negotiation of reproductive autonomy inside a rigid patriarchal system. The American man's constant reference to the operation is wrapped in soft, indirect language. That choice isn't random. It mirrors the wider cultural unwillingness in 1920s America to face the real physical and emotional weight of abortion. Hemingway uses the surrounding landscape as a metaphor here too. Picture the dry, barren side of the valley right next to the lush, fertile side. That split matches the couple's hidden emotional divide perfectly. Even the story's unspoken subtext feels relevant today, tying directly to modern debates over who gets to make choices about their own body. It shows how Hemingway's spare, minimal dialogue can carry timeless conversations about power, consent, and the unfair expectations placed on people based on their gender. Another often overlooked story in the collection, A Clean, Well-Lighted Place, pulls these themes out of war zones and drops them into the dim, quiet night of a Spanish cafe. The old man sitting there just wants a safe space away from the raw, scary nakedness of just existing. That desire lines up exactly with Hemingway's famous iceberg theory. The most important, meaningful parts of a story are the ones hiding under the surface, not the words you actually read on the page. The bright, tidy cafe becomes a temporary shelter for the characters. For a little while, they can put aside the empty, hollow feeling of existential dread that follows them everywhere. The story's soft, quiet look at loneliness actually predicted later famous existential writers like Camus and Sartre. Those thinkers would later argue that life doesn't come with built-in meaning. We have to make that meaning ourselves, even when the world feels totally absurd and pointless. To really get why Hemingway cared so much about masculinity, we have to place his work inside the bigger social and political mood of his time. The years right after World War I were a total crisis for male identity. Soldiers came home carrying invisible wounds. Their old roles as the family's protector and provider felt broken. Mechanized warfare had made individual acts of bravery feel almost meaningless. In response, Hemingway built a new idea of what a man could be. This new ideal valued holding back emotions, pushing through physical pain, and being totally true to your own personal code of integrity, almost like a strict personal rule you never break. You can see this model clearly in the short Happy Life of Francis Macomber. The main character has one short burst of real courage, but it's stacked up against all the times he was scared before. His tragic death ends up working as both a punishment for his past cowardice and a weird form of redemption for that final brave moment. That story also digs into complicated gender dynamics. Margaret, Francis's wife, is shown as both the reason he falls apart and a person making her own choices within the tight limits of her marriage. Her manipulation of the hunting trip is a quiet, subtle kind of feminine power. It challenges the unfair patriarchal system without ever openly fighting it. Modern feminist critics have pointed out this is an early version of the femme fatale archetype, reimagined to show the small, clever ways women could push back against unfair rules back then. It's also worth looking at how people reacted to Men Without Women when it first came out in 1927. Reviews were all over the place. Some critics loved Hemingway's muscular prose, saying it was strong and direct. Others hated what they saw as the cold, unfeeling nature of his characters. But over the decades, more and more scholars have realized the collection speaks to a universal human experience, the constant struggle to connect with other people even when you feel totally isolated. In the 1960s, during the rise of the Beat generation, writers like Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg named Hemingway as a major influence. They admired his ability to say so much with so few words. Their own writing about alienation and spiritual searching echoes the same big existential questions that run through all of Hemingway's early short stories. More recently, digital humanities projects have used computer text analysis to count how often words like silence and absence show up across all of Hemingway's writing. These studies put hard numbers behind what literary critics have said for years. The gaps in Hemingway's stories, the pauses, the ellipses, the cut-off sentences, are just as important as the actual words he wrote. These studies found that in Men Without Women, the number of these unspoken moments jumps way higher in stories about loss. That's not an accident. Hemingway designed it that way to force the reader to fill in the empty spaces themselves. This lines up perfectly with Viktor Frankl's idea of tragic optimism. That's the idea that people don't find purpose in spite of suffering, they find purpose because of it. If you look at popular media today, you can still see Hemingway's themes everywhere. TV shows like The Crown and Mad Men use those same quiet, small moments all the time. A lingering shot of a character staring into an empty glass, a muted conversation by a rain-streaked window. All of these are meant to show the same inner turmoil Hemingway could capture in a single short sentence. The recent comeback of the hard-boiled aesthetic in modern crime dramas like True Detective or Narcos also comes straight from Hemingway's playbook. These shows focus on morally gray main characters who move through worlds where you can't trust any institutions. They speak very little, act fast and decisively, and carry a heavy, unspoken burden that shapes every choice they make. Think about the writers who say Hemingway shaped their work. Cormac McCarthy and Ian McEwan have both spoken about his influence. McCarthy's novel Blood Meridian takes the hard-boiled style to its most brutal edge, yet he keeps Hemingway's spare diction. This forces readers to stare at the stark reality of human cruelty. McEwan's novel Saturday shows a modern take on war trauma. It follows a neurosurgeon whose day is haunted by memories of his father's wartime experiences. This clearly echoes Hemingway's look at how trauma passes from one generation to the next. Hemingway's work also invites a chat with today's neuroscience. Scientists study the brain's default mode network. This network lights up when we are quiet and thinking about ourselves. It is like the space between stimulus and response that Hemingway loved. When readers meet his silences, their brains kick into gear to build stories. They become active meaning makers instead of passive consumers. Here is an everyday analogy. Imagine you pause before answering a tough question. That brief silence lets your mind search for the best reply. Hemingway's blank spaces work the same way for readers. Now consider the ethical side of Hemingway's masculine code. His heroes often hide their feelings, a trait once praised as strength. Modern psychology sees this differently. It encourages vulnerability as a path to resilience. Today's adaptations let characters speak their fears. Stage plays add monologues that reveal inner turmoil. Films highlight psychological breakdowns. These versions challenge the myth of the unflinching hero. They suggest that true strength may lie in naming pain, not denying it. In short, Men Without Women works like a literary laboratory. Hemingway tests the limits of language, masculinity, and big questions. Each story is an open-ended experiment. Every new generation can plug in its own variables: culture, technology, shifting gender ideas. As listeners, readers, or viewers, we stand in a narrow hallway between stimulus and response. We can simply walk through, or we can reshape the passage into a channel for meaning. Picture this: Hemingway's characters poised on the edge of a cliff. Wind whispers through grass on a forgotten battlefield. A train rumbles far off like a heartbeat of a changing world. In those suspended moments, you hold the power to turn silence into significance. You can write your own footnote on the margins of a tale that refuses to be finished. Now imagine a nighttime cafe in Paris, 1926. A young expatriate writer sits across from Hemingway. They nurse glasses of absinthe while the city hums with jazz. Their talk drifts from the mechanics of the Iceberg Technique to the lingering echo of artillery shells that still ring in veterans' minds. Hemingway, who had covered the Spanish Civil War as a reporter, tells how reporting forced him to face a paradox. He must describe horror without slipping into sensationalism. He explains that the lean prose of Men Without Women is not just a style choice. It is a survival tactic, a way to keep the unspeakable at bay while letting readers feel its weight indirectly. Take the story The Killers. It unfolds in a small, rain-slicked town that could be any Midwestern outpost after World War II. Hired guns walk into the diner. They are not just agents of death, they embody a post-war economy where violence has become a commodity. Their casual chat about the price of a bullet mirrors the deflated value placed on human life during the interwar years. Soldiers came home to find their skills outdated and their identities shattered. This economic view joins the psychological one. The Killer's coldness shows a shared numbness, a cultural coping tool akin to what psychologists call emotional numbing in combat veterans. Look at hills like white elephants. The barren landscape acts as a visual metaphor for the reproductive choices facing a couple torn between old traditions and rising feminist ideas of the 1920s. Their dialogue seems to be about a simple procedure. Below the surface lies a negotiation of agency, autonomy, and the quiet pressure of a patriarchal world that often links masculinity to control over female bodies. Hemingway's restraint lets readers sense the tension without spelling it out. This forces us to look closely at the power struggles hiding just beneath the surface. It reflects a larger critique of a certain kind of manliness. This is the kind of masculinity that stays stoic and refuses to speak about pain or vulnerability. This code of silence is not just in books. We see it today in military training manuals. For a long time, these guides praised the act of hiding emotions. They treated emotional suppression as a tactical advantage, like a shield in battle. However, recent studies show a change is happening. New programs now use mindfulness and narrative therapy. They encourage soldiers to name their wounds instead of hiding them. This shift actually connects back to the literary experiments Hemingway started. By showing the cracks in his characters' tough exteriors, he accidentally helped us find a more humane way to understand the stress of combat. The influence of men without women also reaches into the world of visual art. Think of the paintings by Edward Hopper. He used a style called chiaroscuro, which is just a fancy way of saying he used strong contrasts between light and dark. This mirrors how Hemingway used negative space in his writing. Both artists make emptiness feel like a physical presence in the room. We see this in film too. Directors like Jim Jarmusch have borrowed this minimalist style of dialogue. They create scenes where silence does all the heavy lifting for the story. It proves that Hemingway's legacy still shapes how we see and hear the feeling of absence. As you think about these deep connections, remember that every new interpretation adds something new. Whether it happens in a classroom, a theater, or an online forum, it is like adding another brushstroke to an unfinished canvas that Hemingway started. The fact that these stories are never fully told is an invitation. It asks us to get involved, to ask questions, and ultimately to write in the margins using our own voices.